And we'll continue with the 9th chapter of An Acceptable Time. Once ashore, she was greeted by an old man with a face full of fine wrinkles, like the lines of an etching. He held out his hands to Polly and helped her out of the canoe. "Polly," she nodded. "Tynak," he said. "Tynak greets Polly." He led her across the narrow beach and then over grass that crunched dryly under her feet. He took her to a lean-to, where there was a couch of ferns similar to Anival's fern beds. Tynak indicated that Polly was to sit, and he himself squatted back on his heels. Speaking with Tynak, who had an authority that declared him to be the leader of the people across the lake, was not easy, but Polly managed to learn that the battle had been no more than a cover-up for her abduction. No one had been seriously wounded, no prisoners taken other than Polly. Zachary stood just outside the lean-to, and the old man summoned him with a smile so faint that there was no joy in it, but rather a sense of solemnity. "See, I've brought her, Tynak," Zachary said. "Now will the healer fix my heart?" He put his hand to his chest and looked eagerly at the chief. Tynak embarked on a long, vehement speech which Polly could not follow. His language was mostly short, sharp syllables, and he was speaking quickly. She understood only isolated words, goddess, rain, anger, but nothing coherent fitted together. She looked out at a land far drier and browner than that of the people of the wind. What grass there was between beach and lean-to was brittle. The leaves of the trees drooped dryly, drifting listlessly to the ground. Over the lake, the sky had a mustardy yellow tinge at the horizon, staining the night. The air was so humid that the farther shore was not even visible. Only the mountains rose out of the murk. They were higher, looked at from this side of the lake, and their peaks held more snow. The melting of the additional snow might be what would help keep the land of the people of the wind fertile and green. The moon shone hazily through drifting clouds. Tynak rose and turned to Polly, indicating that she was to follow him. He was much shorter than she had realized when he met the canoe. His legs were short sticks under a skin tunic, but he moved with authority and dignity. She followed him across a compound of tents, many more than on her side of the lake. There were people moving about. Tynak spoke, and what she understood was that in the daytime the sun was no longer gentle, but was hot and burning. He took her toward what should have been a cornfield of stalks that had been harvested and cut down, but which, in the moonlight, were dark midgets, barely tasseled. Tynak spoke again more slowly, and she thought he was telling her that his people were kind to the land, treated it with respect, but it had turned on them. He looked at her with small, very dark eyes and told her that without rain they would starve. He led her back to the lean-to and showed her a rolled-up fur covering in the corner. Then he bowed to her and left, signaling to Zachary to come with him. A few minutes later, one of the young women of the tribe brought Polly a bowl of some kind of stew, put it down by her, and looked at her shyly. Polly thanked her, adding, "I am Polly. You are—" The girl smiled. "Go." Then she hurried away. Polly saw that the tribe was gathered around a fire, sharing a meal together from which she was excluded. Why? The raiders had been included in the feast of the people of the wind. But Klep had said that the people across the lake treated their prisoners differently from the way the people of the wind did. She ate the stew, which was passable, because she knew she needed to keep up her strength. Probably the meat from which the stew was made came from one of the beasts stolen from the people of the wind. Then she sat, knees drawn up to her chin, thinking. She realized that the people across the lake might have had no feast, no meal, without what they had taken during the raids made on the more fortunate people whose land was still fruitful. She had seen poor or primitive people before, but never those who were starving. She lay down, knowing that she needed to rest, but every muscle was tense, and the singing and shouting of the tribe kept her awake. It was not the happy singing of the people of the wind. Rather, it was a plaintive chant. Were they worried about Klep, who had been taken prisoner? Klep, who was to be their next leader? She lay with her eyes closed, trying to rest, so that she would be ready for whatever was in store, feeling within herself a desperate quietness. It was inconceivable that she should be trapped 3,000 years in the past, that she might never get home, and yet here she was, a prisoner, because of Zachary. But Zachary had not closed the time gate. No, but he had brought her here, across the lake. Zachary was too terrified of dying to think of anything or anybody else. In his case, what would she have done? She did not know. She closed her eyes and drifted off into a state between waking and sleeping. In her half-dream, she felt a strange security, that she was surrounded by love that came to her from across the lake, from the people of the wind, from the bishop and Anarel, Corrales, Tav, even from Clep, who knew where she was and who she was with, far better than the others. She turned on her side, relaxing into the protection of their love. In her half-sleep, she saw Tav and looked into his silver eyes, saw his fair, thick lashes, his mop of pale hair. He was questioning her, affirming that she was the goddess of the people across the lake and wanting to know how they captured her. Longing for the reality of his presence, she slid more deeply into sleep. Zachary and one of the men kidnapped me. She saw Tav's outraged scowl. Why would anyone, even that Zach, do such a thing? Polly murmured. Clep was right when he said that maybe Brown Earth promised something to Zachary. Promised what? Tav demanded. Zachary was promised that their healer would fix his heart if he brought me to them. But Zachary should never have done that. Now it was Anarel who was angry. If you think you're going to die and you're told someone can keep you alive, that becomes the only thing you can think of. Anyhow, I'm sure he doesn't believe that there's any kind of threat to me. I mean, they wouldn't hurt someone they think is a goddess, would they? They will not do anything unless the moon is full, Tav said. And oh, Polly, we will not let them do anything to you. Clep is grateful to you for having helped set his leg, for having held his hands against the pain. He is nice, Anarel said softly. He is good. He says that his honor is bound to you to help him, and to help us free you. Polly shifted position, holding on to the dream, not wanting to wake up. In the dream, Tav leaned toward her and placed his fingers gently over her ears. Then he touched her eyes, her mouth. We give you the gift of hearing, he said. Clep sends you the hearing of the trees. We give you the gift of hearing, Anarel said softly. I give you the gift of hearing the lake, for I know that you have much love of water. And I, Tav's voice was soft, I give you the gift of understanding the voice of the wind, for we are the people of the wind, and the wind is the voice of the goddess. Listen and do not be afraid. Do not be afraid, Anarel repeated. Do not be afraid, their words echoed in her ears as she turned again on the hard earth and slid out of the dream into wakefulness. She tried holding on to Tav's promise that nothing would happen to her, but despite her own affirmation that the people across the lake would not do anything to harm someone they thought to be a goddess, an inner voice told her that to these people whose land was devastated by drought, the sacrifice of a goddess would be a sacrifice of great power. She lay on the fern pallet, pulling the fur rug over her. She wanted to recover the comfort of the dream, but she could not. Her mind began searching for ways of escape. She was a strong swimmer. She had swum all her life, and her stamina and endurance were far greater than ordinary. There had even been a suggestion that she try for the Olympics, a realistic suggestion considering her capabilities, but she agreed with her parents that it was a competitiveness she did not want. She thought about the lake and realized that the distance was too great, especially in cold water. Her grandparents' pool was heated and was barely 72 or 3 degrees. The lake would be much colder, unless it was her last hope. She would not attempt the lake. Where was Zachary while she was isolated in this small lean-to? The sound of the people singing and shouting was fainter. She knelt on the rug and could see several groups leaving the fires and going to their tents. The feast, if indeed it had been a feast, for what? The coming of the goddess was over. The darkness was tangible. She felt it as a heavy pressure on her chest. But this is fear, she thought. If I could only stop being afraid. She shuddered. How were sacrificial victims killed? With a knife? That would be the quickest, the kindest way. She breathed slowly, deliberately. There was no sound from any of the tents. The water of the lake lapped gently against the shore. She listened, tried to remember the gifts Tav and Anarel had given her in her dream. There was the gift of listening to the water. Hush, the water said. Hush, hush, peace, sleep. The wind lifted, stirred in the trees, rattling dry leaves. The lean-to was attached at the back to the trunk of a great oak. The branches overreached the skin roof, adding their protection. In the summer, when the tree was fully leafed, the lean-to would be protected from the sun. Clep had sent her the gift of hearing the trees. She listened with a certainty that indeed gifts had been sent to her, blowing in the wind across the dark waters of the lake. She heard a steady throb like a great heart beating. The rhythm never faltered. It was an affirmation of steadfastness. The oak was older than any trees in her own time, hundreds of years old. It was, and its being was a strange comfort. Last she turned to Tav's gift, cherishing it, the gift of hearing the voice of the wind, and she listened as the wind stirred gently among the dry leaves above her, touched the waters of the lake, ruffling its surface, reached into the lean-to, and brushed against her cheeks. She heard no words, but she felt a deepening of comfort and assurance. She slept. When she opened her eyes, it was daylight. Tynak was squatting by her, looking at her. Behind him, the dawn light was rosy on the water. The sun was rising behind the snow-capped mountains that shielded the people of the wind. But now, as Polly looked at the mountains from the far side of the lake, they seemed wild and menacing. Around the compound, people were stirring, and she could smell smoke from the cook fires. Long rays of light reached into the lean-to, touched Polly. Tynak held up one hand, pointing. At first, she had no idea what he was indicating with his ancient finger. Then she realized that it was her hair. Tynak had never seen red hair before. At night, it would not have shone as it did in the long rays of sunlight. She did not know how to explain that red hair was not particularly unusual in her time, so she smiled politely. "Good morning." "Clep," there was urgency in Tynak's voice. She spoke slowly. "Clep has a broken leg. Our healer is taking care of him. He will be all right." "He will return?" "I don't know about that. I don't know what happens with prisoners." "He must return. You are goddess. We need help." "I'm not a goddess. I'm an ordinary human being." "You called snake. It came." "I'm sorry. It didn't have anything to do with me. I don't have that kind of power. I don't know why she came. It was just a coincidence." She hoped he could understand enough of her faltering Ogham to get the gist of what she was saying. "Snake, who is?" "Louise, just an ordinary black snake. They're harmless." "Her name?" "Louise the Larger." Tynak grunted, gave her an uncomprehending look, then turned, and without speaking further, left the lean-to. In a few minutes he returned with a wooden bowl full of some kind of gruel. She took it. "Thank you." "Can you call rain?" he demanded. "I wish I could." "You must try." His wrinkled face was kind, sad, in no way sinister or threatening. Even in my own time, she thought, where we think we have so much control over so many things, we haven't succeeded in forecasting the weather, much less controlling it. We too have droughts and floods and earthquakes. We live on a planet that is still unstable. "You will try?" Tynak prodded. "I will try. Where you come from, you have gods, goddesses?" She nodded. Because of her isolated island living, she had had little institutional training in religion. There had been no available Sunday schools, but family dinner table conversations included philosophy and theology as well as science. Her godfather was an English canon who had taught her about a God of love and compassion, a God who was mysterious and tremendous, but not to be understood as 2 atoms of hydrogen plus 1 atom of oxygen make water could be understood. A God who cared about all that had been created in love, and that included all these people who had lived 3,000 years ago. Bishop Kalubra, too, believed in a God of total love, and so, despite her pragmatism, did Dr. Louise. Anarol had talked with the Presence. That was as good a name as any. "We believe in the Presence," Polly said firmly to Tynak, "the one who made us all and cares about us. This Presence wants sacrifice?" "Only love," she said, "but perhaps that was the greatest sacrifice of all." This Presence sends rain?" "Not always. We have droughts too." "Where you come from?" "When," she thought, but nodded. It was impossible to explain. Did she have anything from her own time which would be impressive to Tynak? She felt in the pockets of the red anorak. Yes, she had several things, artifacts that might seem to Tynak to have power. Her fingers touched Zachary's icon. She pulled it out, held it in front of Tynak. Zachary had brought the icon for her. Zachary had bought the icon for her because he cared about her. Tynak stared at the icon intently, almost fearfully, then looked at her questioningly. She pointed to the child in the icon, then to herself. Then she pointed to the angel and stretched out her arms as though embracing all of Tynak's compound. The tents, the lake, the great snow-capped mountains on the far side. Tynak took the icon from her and again stared at it. Then at Polly, then back at the icon. He pointed to the angel, his fingers touching great wings. Can fly. Yes. Goddess. Polly shook her head. Angel. He sounded the word out for her. Angel. Angel will help you? She nodded. Angel will let no harm come to you? Angel loves me, she replied carefully. He nodded several times, turned the icon over, looked at the plain wood of the back, turned it so that he was looking at the angel and the child again. Where you get? Zachary gave it to me. Zach, you speak now to the Zach. She held out her hand for the icon. Please give it back to me. He pulled his hand away, still holding the icon. Please, give it back, Polly repeated and reached for it. No, Tynak keep, angel power. Why did she care so much about keeping the icon? She tried to grab it away from him. If she tried to grab it away with him, others would come to his rescue immediately. She stared into his dark eyes. Angel has good power for me, bad power for you. Not so. I take Angel. I take your power. It was absurd to feel so threatened by Tynak's taking the icon. It was nothing more than a painting on wood. Zachary had said that it had no value, but it was affirmation that he cared about her, that he meant it when he promised that he never wanted to hurt her. Her voice shook. Bad power for you. She could only repeat herself. She stopped as he heard a low growl, wet, dripping. Og bounded toward her. Og! She was almost as glad to see him as she had been to see Tav. He was at her side, baring his teeth at Tynak. Give! She reached for the icon again. See? Good power for me, bad power for you. Tynak put the icon into her hand and walked away very quickly. Og licked her hand gently, and she burst into tears. And that is the end of chapter 9.